Toast to Scotland. Well, there we go, that's it, I'm getting it right this time. It's a privilege to do the Toast to Scotland. It's a toast that our chair was pointing out will be getting done not just to length and breadth of Scotland, but around the world. And I think it's important that when we do consider giving a toast to Scotland, we realise that toasting Scotland, we're toasting the people of Scotland. And equally, it's not just those who reside here, but it's those who have gone abroad, sometimes generations ago. And so what I'd like to do is just take some time to reflect about Scottish societies abroad, because this is something that's taking place, not just, as I say, in places you would expect with an expat Scottish community, but there are Burns nights and Scottish celebrations, whether in Vietnam, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, or wherever. I have to say, I think there's a section of Scottish society, and I used to be one of them, that used to be quite disparaging about Scottish societies abroad, that took the view, well, they're just full of middle-aged men, getting unca foo, singing Scottish songs, getting half cut or whatever else. And I have to say that's probably a view that many in Scotland sadly still hold. And yet the history of the St Andrews societies, the Caledonian clubs, the Burns societies, I think is actually something that's part of the history of Scotland, it's part of the Scottish people. And indeed I remember researching and I was quite ashamed of some of the views I had, because what we've got to remember is that these societies have kept the cause of Scotland alive for 300 years. There are many a nation and many a people who have disappeared. There are many a nation or people who don't have the same level of celebration that Scotland has, and yet they have their own governments or embassies. So there's something I think we have to take pride in there. And I do remember simply being in Chicago and speaking to the Scottish Society in Chicago, and I think they encapsulated, because they told me a tale that they used to meet the boats coming in, bringing Scottish immigrants, and they used to try and provide work and they used to provide accommodation. And I remember they had a record of an old lady who'd gone to meet her son or daughter, I think it was, and moved to Chicago. By the time she got there, they'd actually moved on to Spokane or Toledo. But they provided a roof over their head and they kept her through a Chicago winter. And you remember that in the absence of a welfare state, these people provided care and shelter, and as I say, that's a matter that we should take pride in. Because quite often people who left Scotland left with very little. Sometimes they had very little probably to be thankful to Scotland for, apart from an education, and yet, as I say, they kept the cause of Scotland alive for centuries. Since it's a Burns night, I was reading a book about Lincoln and Burns, and they were pointing out that, it was mentioned earlier, but on the centenary of Burns' birth in 1859, over 60 American cities held a Burns celebration, including one in Springfield, Illinois, that was attended by one Abraham Lincoln. So as I say, these things have gone on for centuries. When Scotland was part of the British Empire, the most powerful nation that ruled the earth at that stage, where there were no embassy, no Scottish Parliament, no Scottish government, and yet they maintained our links. So I think that's something that we should take interest in. I went away and researched these things. I remember going down to London, because the first Scottish society actually was in London. It was only established in 1603 when James went down there, because prior to then Scots tended not to go. And I remember speaking to them and they told us that because actually in the late 16th century they'd done a register of aliens down in London. And actually the number of Scots in London in the late 16th century was between 50 and 60. There were thousands of Flemish people and things like that. There was no need for Scotland to go. There was no M74, there was no A1, there was no trade service. And actually if you took the ships out of Leith or out of Aberdeen or probably even out of Stirling, then the prevailing winds tended to take you either across to Scandinavia or they took you down to the Low Countries. You didn't have to tack back up the Thames. It was a very difficult journey. But I remember chatting away to them because they had been there and they provided accommodation for Scots who have wounded soldiers or whatever. And indeed, even up until now, they provide assistance for Scots who sometimes are wounded in other ways, whether with alcohol or drug problems. So we should take pride in them. But I asked them to tell me about Scottish societies abroad. And I remember saying, well, you've got to go and see the oldest Scottish society abroad. And I said, who's that? And they said, oh, it's the Boston Scots. Can't be right. Can't be right. Boston, that's New England. Why would you have a Scottish society in New England? Besides, it's Boston, it's Ireland, it's Little Ireland. And the history of the Boston Scots is a story that really should be told, and I was ashamed that I didn't know about it. Because the history of the Boston Scots goes back to 1657. There's not many societies in Scotland can claim their roots back to 1657. But the Boston Scots go back to 1657, because the history of the Boston Scots was in 1650 when we were still an independent nation with our government. Cromwell came up to lay waste to us and to fight here. And in 1650 a battle took place at Dunblane, and Scottish soldiers were slaughtered in their thousands, indeed tens of thousands, because as in many a day we had the high ground but decided to cede it. We had the advantage of surprise that the Presbyterian ministers told us not to fight in the Sabbath, so by the time General Wesley actually started fighting with Cromwell's troops, we had lost the high ground, we had lost the advantage, and we were well and truly slaughtered. But Scottish soldiers, those who survived, were marched south. Many died in what can only be described as a death camp. It's now part of Durham Cathedral. And the rest were sentenced to 7 years penal servitude. And that's why in 1657 the Scottish Society of Massachusetts was formed, because there were prisoners with no way home, there were no flights and no boats. So to say, I think that's something that's a story that deserves to be told. I also remember, since we're talking about Burns, they were the ones that told me about the great story of the word gringo, because it wasn't just in New England that we were having Scottish societies, but they were down in the Battle of the Alamo. This is a great story, since I don't think we're singing Green Grow the Rashes, but it's well worth telling. But you remember that in the Battle of the Alamo, almost all who fought were Scotch-Irish soldiers. Sam Houston, Davy Crockett, Jim Bowie. The names were either Scottish or those who had gone from Scotland across to Ulster and the rest of Ireland. But of course the story there, and I remember me come back and tell my wife, he'd ridicule me, but I will tell the story to you. He said, "Do you know that story in history, the word gringo, that you get in cowboy movies?" And I says, "No, what's that?" Well, he said, "That's because the marching tune of the Scots-Irish soldiers was Green Grow the Rashes O. And the forces of General Santillana, the Mexican army, they couldn't understand it, so they just said, well, that must be gringo." And I came back and told my wife, I said, "You should laugh." She says, "That's just not true." Well, I have to say, I don't know whether it's true or not, but I can see, if you go look at the Oxford English Dictionary, you will see that there are 4 possible derivations for the term gringo. One is the green uniforms worn by the Scots-Irish soldiers. Another is the marching tune of the Scots-Irish soldiers. So as I say, these matters were being celebrated there. And since I was reminiscing with our chair about prison service, sometimes I get told, why don't we send all these Scots, why do we have to take them back here? Well, I said, I frequently have to say, well, the days of being able to transport people have long since passed. But again, that's something in Scotland we're never sure about. Did we transport people or did we not? Everybody knows that the Irish were transported, sadly, in their tens of thousands. And we know that people were transported from the Cockney slums or wherever else. The answer is 8,000 Scots were transported to Port Jackson, to Botany Bay. But if you read the history of the Scots in Australia, the amazing thing about those who were transported, you weren't transported for murder because you were hung. You weren't transported for theft of a horse because you got hung for that as well. But you were transported for thieving, for offences that go with, quite often, with social inequality and poverty and deprivation. But the history of the Scots in Australia is the 8,000. There is not one recorded instance of a Scottish bushranger. There is no Scottish equivalent of Ned Kelly. And the argument given, if you read the history of the Scots in Australia, is that if you give people a land of opportunity, then they take it. So I have to say I frequently use that in matters here, but that's the history of some of the Scots in Australia. We do take attitudes that we sometimes do try to leave behind and do regret, because I remember meeting and getting history of the Scottish Society in Queensland and Brisbane, and they were telling me that they'd all formed, they said, from a Presbyterian college that had been founded at the University of Queensland, because I was in this wonderful grounds in San Lucia, the outskirts of Brisbane, and they were saying, well, our roots go back to this Presbyterian college that was founded to train ministers for the Presbyterian Church, and it started as Emmanuel College. And I found that was very interesting. I got the history, and then I just said, out of curiosity, why was it Emmanuel College and not St Andrews College? And I said, well, that's very simple, he said, because there had been a St Andrews College established in Sydney, and the rivalry between Queensland and New South Wales, you couldn't have a St Andrews College with the other one. And I said, well, that's very interesting. He says, but why didn't we call it after one of our Celtic saints? Because I'm always surprised that we actually have St Andrew as our patron saint, rather than Ninian or Columba or whoever else that we would have a greater claim to having brought Christianity to Scotland than St Andrew. To which the response was truth. But this is Australia, and they're girly names. Now, honestly, I've never quite worked out why manual's perfectly acceptable, but nearly the form aren't. But as I say, when we went abroad, these Scottish societies looked after each other. They kept the cause of Scotland in terms of burn suppers, but they also kept, I think, our values alive. And I'm most minded when I met the Canterbury Scots down in Christchurch in New Zealand, which is the most Scottish country other than Scotland that you'll ever get involved. But they told me the story of John Mackenzie. I think it's great about the values that people took with them. Because John Mackenzie was actually the Rural Affairs Minister. And the history of John Mackenzie was he grew up in Alness, and he wasn't cleared, but he saw the clearances in the town of Alness as people were being taken to the coast to be departed. And he vowed that he would never, ever, in his new land, see such poverty and degradation happen. And he got into office and became the Minister for Land and Rural Affairs in New Zealand. And of course, in New Zealand in about the 1870s, New Zealand actually was going through some difficulties because gold had been discovered in Victoria, and people were emigrating from New Zealand to go to the state of Victoria. And what was happening was that rich landowners were buying up the land, and New Zealand was in danger of ending up like something in the Argentine with whole areas being owned by individuals. But he remembered the deprivation that had happened in Scotland, and he vowed that that wouldn't happen, and so he took it upon himself to break up the landed estates to compulsory purchase. And that's actually why New Zealand is now viewed as a land of small farmers, because Mackenzie said that he wasn't going to allow it to happen in New Zealand what he'd seen happen in Scotland, where people were taken off their land and were sent to the sea and were put abroad. So as I say, that's why I think we should celebrate rather than denigrate these Scottish societies abroad. Sometimes we can laugh at them, and I've been at some of them abroad myself, and some of the get-up and some of the gear that goes is really quite astonishing, I have to say, but I usually wish them well, because if you've ever done a burn supper in Halifax or Nova Scotia when it's about -24, a kilt is not a get-up that's best placed to keep you warm, but good luck to them. But these things are there. The only final story I'll tell, because people say, well, how can they continue to celebrate Scotland when they're no longer in Scotland, they don't know Scotland? And I think the great story about that is actually a story of Simon Fraser, who's viewed as one of the great Scottish Canadians. Simon Fraser. And the amazing story about Simon Fraser is he wasn't born in Scotland. He never ever came to Scotland. Fraser was born in Vermont, and as with many Scots, his parents took the wrong side in the American Revolution, and they had to move up to what was then British North America, and they moved up to Ontario. But he grew up in a household where he was told tales of Scotland, of the land of mighty mountains and flowing rivers. And so he had a mental image of Scotland, and he had the songs of Scotland that some that I say we disparage, people mock for singing. But he had this history of Scotland, and Simon Fraser's goes down in folklore obviously because the great Fraser River that runs down to the Pacific is named after him. And the amazing thing about Simon Fraser was when he was discovering the Fraser River and was coming down what's now part of British Columbia, he actually saw these mighty mountains and he saw these flowing rivers, and he thought, this is what Scotland must look like. And that's why the part round Prince Rupert he called New Caledonia, to give a synergy with Nova Scotia on the other side. He never got to Scotland, he never saw Scotland, but I think nobody would deny his right to be a Scot. And therefore when people in Canada or New Zealand or Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan or whatever choose to celebrate Scotland, then we should welcome the fact that, notwithstanding the fact that frequently left here with very little, sometimes in very cruel circumstances, because Scotland can be a cruel country, and for those of us who still follow the national football team or rugby team, it can be extremely cruel, but there we go. But as I say, I think that shows that we should enjoy that and take faith in that, because that, as I say, is what we're celebrating in Scotland. Scotland isn't just the physical landscape, the geography and the topography. Scotland's the values that we think are held to by John Mackenzie, are upheld by those that looked after the poor and the destitute, and those who landed in foreign shores with no money and little assistance. Those are the values that we want, and that's why, as I say, it is a privilege as we come closer to a great day of destiny, that we should remember the whole purpose of Scotland, the whole purpose of what those of us who campaign on in the SNP is to be able to create in our own native land what far too many people for far too many generations were not able to do in their own country. to get employment, to get advancement, they had to leave and go somewhere else. The time has come when we should be able to achieve these things in our own land, and in listening to the immortal memory from Graham, to also recognise that what we want to do is to be able to participate on an international stage for the good of humanity and for the good of mankind, not in terms of fighting illegal wars in places that our people have no interest and need to be. So as I say, that's why I'd like to ask you to join me in the toast to the Scottish people, both here and abroad, but especially the toast to Scotland.
Scotland.